The Industrial Revolution. So, really we're seeing that in the late 1700s, the Northeast is starting to be ready for the Industrial Revolution. However, before we actually get to that, we have to kind of set the stage what was occurring during this time. The system of manufacturing at this time was actually two different systems. First of all, you had the putting out system, also known as the piecework, where basically local merchants would furnish like raw materials to households, and then these households would basically be paid per piece, thus piecework, for the labor that converted these raw materials into a manufactured product. Whereas when you're looking at like cities and large towns, the manufacturing is more going to be done by like artisans. And I've talked about artisans before, that you're going to more see small batches of finished goods. Generally, it's going to be, they started out as an apprentice, then became a journeyman, and then became an artisan in their own right and set up their own shop. And then the system repeats. The thing is, these systems work well enough, but the factory system is going to really undercut both household and artisanal manufacturing, especially after like 1815 in the United States, because the factory system is basically going to be able to produce goods far more quicker and more cheaply per worker, because it's going to subdivide these skills into series of semi-skilled tasks. So you don't need to know how to do every single step in making that shoe. You need to know how to make the shoe just this one particular step that you do over and over and over. And so you get really good and really fast at that. And so this boosts workers' productivity. And then on top of that, what boosts productivity is going to be like power-driven machinery. Great Britain is going to be known the most for pioneering a lot of these technological advances, and then they're going to be brought to America, but they're going to be put to use here, quite frankly, really a lot. So, for instance, when the Industrial Revolution starts, and you can see how I have it like up here in parentheses of about 1760 through 1840, we're going to see the Industrial Revolution really is more going to have a larger impact on America after the War of 1812. So when we're looking at like 1815-ish. Industrial labor needs to be cheap for you to convert over to the factory systems. And industrial labor it was more expensive in the United States than it was in England. Part of the reason for this was land was abundant in the United States. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and Americans just preferred having that independence of being a farm worker and owning their land rather than, working for someone else in a mill. So actually your first mill workers in the United States tend to be children and adolescents. So you're going to get the first systems really put in place are going to be things like the Rhode Island system. Now the Rhode Island system, basically here a company would own land as well as a mill. And so what would happen is the father of the family would get a plot of the company owned land. The mother would be provided with like raw materials to do piecework, and a lot of times they would put the children to work in the mills. Now this sufficed for smaller mills, but it's really not enough for the bigger mechanized factories of New England starting after about 1812. That's when we start seeing more and more the Waltham system, also sometimes called the Lowell system. Basically, these mills would recruit unmarried adolescent daughters of farmers across New England. The thing is, these women would be paid low wages, but the wages were better than just doing piecework at home or like being a domestic servant. And it gives them a bit of like financial independence. The thing is, by having these women move out of their homes so young, people were concerned that it might be, morally corrupting, especially with these conditions in the mills and towns that they're living in. So these manufacturers under the Waltham system would set up like paternalistic or moral controls basically to protect these daughters. They were supposed to, live in company-owned boarding houses that imposed curfews. They would even screen their visitors and mandate church attendance. These women were generally expected to work 6 days a week. We do see, though, actually one of the largest strikes in American history at this time is at Lowell, where women would protest wage reductions. So we do see, we're going to start seeing the idea of striking and unions and everything during this time period. However, with the economic downturn of the 1830s, mill conditions are going to grow worse, and more often we're going to see Irish children specifically being sent to work at mills at earlier and earlier ages. Basically, they were just desperate for work. And the thing is, the Irish immigrants and children that would go to work in these mills, they didn't leave after 2 or 3 years like a lot of the New Englander women had done. And so by the early 1850s, it's something like over half the textile operators were Irish women. You also can see like the mid-Atlantic region, there just wasn't as many young women available for factory work. And so right from the get-go, immigrants were that important source of workers for manufacturing roles. Immigrants are going to play a really extremely crucial role when it comes to urban manufacturing, because having a cheap immigrant labor force basically drives down the cost of the finalized product, which makes it more accessible to a larger population of the United States, which in turn makes the factory more money, and then they can invest that in more factories and more technology and et cetera, et cetera. And so having that cheap immigrant labor force really is what helps manufacturing get going and the Industrial Revolution in some way get going in the North in America. Because, by the way, when I'm talking about all of this, I'm really talking about the northern regions. Notice we've already covered the South, and there's very, very, very little very little manufacturing and thus urbanization in the South. We're going to see that as much as I've talked about like women and children, there are going to be still men that are making up a lot of these manufacturing workers, and a lot of times they're from like poor rural families lacking enough land to pass on to all of the different male heirs basically. The thing is, for all of these workers that are going to be working in manufacturing enterprises, regardless of their sex or their age, they don't tend to have a lot of specific skills, and therefore they have very little bargaining power. It's an economic necessity for them to continue to have these jobs. We're also going to see after about 1815, the United States is going to begin to close that technological gap with Great Britain. We're going to see that mechanics here are experimenting with new designs, improving new ones, patenting new inventions. You can see like a great example of this would be Eli Whitney's cotton gin, quickly and cheaply removing seeds from cotton fibers, which then, spurred cotton cultivation across the South. The other thing is America's going to make their own contribution to the Industrial Revolution, which is going to be in the form of interchangeable parts, or also known as the American system of manufacturing. Basically, this was a technique pioneered in the United States in the first half of that 19th century that relies on precision manufacturing with the use of interchangeable parts, meaning that you're having low-cost, standardized mass production. You can kind of see this here, but think of it in modern terms. If you have like a TV remote control and you need a new battery for it, you can go to the store and you can buy a specific size battery, and you know it's going to fit the remote because the remote was made for that size battery. It's an interchangeable part that you can take out that one part and replace it with another and know that it's the same size, shape, scope, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you can see here that now, like, rather than having every single part be made by an individual and be slightly different every time, with interchangeable parts on this gun, any one of these bits could break down and you can replace it with a new part. And that makes it a lot cheaper. If anyone here has ever bought a custom frame or something like that, you know how expensive custom work can be. And so low cost, because you have that standardized mass production. Also, you're going to see other technological gains during this time period. Things like the 1840s, you get the adoption of the stationary steam engine. This is going to drive a lot of industry to locate at like port cities in the Northeast, as well as like some of those booming cities on the Great Lakes, partly because they want to have a steady and reliable source of water, but they also want to make sure this water is not affected by like the whims of nature. And so you see a lot of them building like dams and canals, which actually in turn changes the ecology of a lot of regions and upset a lot of farmers nearby because it could change what water they were able to get access to. They would argue, though, that water should be treated like a commodity that could contribute to economic progress. And basically, laws at this time are going to treat nature like an economic resource that should be engineered and bought and sold more than anything else. So, looking at all these different types of working environments, I want you to characterize these different types of working environments during the Industrial Revolution in one sentence as a part of your journal.